I thought a quiet cabin in the mountains would be the safest place I could possibly stay. No neighbors, no traffic, no noise, just trees and darkness. But isolation doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it just means there's no one left to hear you if something goes wrong. I didn't realize that someone had already claimed that place before I ever arrived, and he wasn't planning on letting me leave. Back in 2015, I took a break from college and spent several months driving across the country, living out of my car and crashing wherever I could. When I reached the eastern side of the US, my cousin Ryan offered to let me stay at his cabin for a few days. It was tucked just south of the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by thick forest and rolling hills. I jumped at the offer. After weeks on the road, having a real bed, walls, heat, and a shower sounded like luxury. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was honestly surprised by how nice it was. It wasn't some tiny hunting shack or old log hut. It looked more like a modern vacation home. Clean siding, wide windows, a large deck, and plenty of space inside. It felt expensive. Too nice to be letting someone crash there for free. I started unloading my gear from the car, carrying bags inside one trip at a time. On one of my trips back to the car, something caught my attention in the distance. Someone was standing near the tree line. They weren't close to the path or the driveway. They were deeper in the woods, partially hidden by the shadows between the trunks. From where they stood, the only thing visible through the trees was the cabin, and me moving back and forth. There was no doubt they were watching me. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another cabin was nearby. Maybe it was a hiker passing through private land without realizing it. I didn't know the area well enough to assume anything. Still, the feeling wasn't right. I finished grabbing the last of my things, locked the car, and stepped inside. Before closing the door, I glanced back toward the trees. The figure was still there, still facing the cabin, not moving. I locked the door and sent Ryan a text letting him know I'd arrived safely. Then I added a second message. Hey, weird question. Is anyone else ever on your property? I just saw a guy standing in the trees watching the cabin. I went back to unpacking and forgot about the message for a while. By the time I checked my phone again, almost an hour had passed and the sun had already dropped below the horizon. Ryan's reply made my stomach tighten. The cabin sits on about 40 acres. It's fenced off. No one should be out there unless they're trespassing. That changed everything. Before, the guy had just been strange. Now he was somewhere he absolutely shouldn't have been. Alone, watching me. I walked back to the window and looked outside again, but beyond the glow of the porch lights, the forest was completely swallowed by darkness. I couldn't even see the tree line anymore, just a wall of black. It felt like something could be standing 10 feet away from the glass, and I'd never know. I pulled the curtain shut and tried to calm myself down by turning on a movie. I laid back on the bed and tried to let the distraction pull my mind away from the anxiety creeping up my spine. It worked. For a while. About an hour into the movie, something flickered in the corner of my vision. I turned my head toward the window. A small gap in the curtain revealed nothing but darkness and my own faint reflection in the glass. I stared for a few seconds, convincing myself it was nothing. Then I stood up and walked toward the window. That's when I heard it. Footsteps sprinting through the grass outside, fast, heavy, moving away from the cabin. By the time I reached the window, there was nothing to see, only darkness. But I could still faintly hear movement disappearing into the distance. My heart was pounding hard enough to make my hands shake. I immediately called Ryan and told him what happened. He didn't hesitate. He told me to call the police right away. I hung up and dialed 911. Considering how remote the cabin was, the officer arrived faster than I expected. But whoever had been watching me was long gone. There was nothing for the officer to realistically search in the woods in the middle of the night. No footprints, no clear direction of travel, no evidence. He told me to lock up, stay inside, and call again if anything else happened. Then he left, and suddenly, I was alone again. The unease never left me that night. I considered packing up and leaving, but the idea of hauling all my gear back and forth to the car in total darkness felt even more dangerous. I stayed inside, checking the windows constantly, even though I couldn't see anything outside. By midnight, I was pacing the cabin, double-checking locks, listening to every creak and gust of wind. I delayed going to sleep as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually won. I turned off the lights, locked myself into the bedroom, and crawled into bed. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it didn't last long. I woke up far earlier than I should have. The room was still completely dark. No hint of sunrise, no glow through the curtains. My phone said a little after 4 a.m. I'd only been asleep a couple of hours at most. My chest felt tight the second I became aware. That same uneasy pressure from earlier rushed back into my body, like my instincts had been waiting for me to wake up. I lay still for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the low whistle of wind brushing against the thin windows. The old wood creaked softly as the temperature shifted outside. Nothing else moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep without checking the cabin again. My mind wouldn't allow it. Slowly, I slid out of bed and turned on the hallway light, keeping the bedroom door open behind me so I wouldn't trap myself in the dark. I stood there for a few seconds, just listening. Nothing. I started walking down the hallway when I heard it. 2 dull thumps. They came from the far end of the cabin, the side where the small reading nook and kitchen were. The sound was muted but heavy, like something had bumped into the exterior wall or door. I froze in place. My pulse slammed against my ears. I strained to listen harder, barely breathing. A faint shadow shifted at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light spilling from the ceiling fixture. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of my eyes. Then the shadow moved again, slowly, deliberately. A shape separated itself from the darkness. A figure stepped into the hallway. Even from that distance, I recognized the outline, the posture, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward. It was the same man I'd seen standing in the trees earlier that evening. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I turned and ran back into the bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly it took 2 tries to get the lock engaged. The silence that followed was unbearable. I stood there frozen, barely daring to breathe. I expected him to chase me, to rush the door, to start pounding on it. Nothing happened. Then, slow footsteps, heavy, controlled. They moved down the hallway toward my door and stopped just on the other side of it. He was standing there, waiting. I clutched my phone in my hand, thumb hovering over the screen. I wanted to call for help, but fear stopped me. What if the sound of my voice triggered something? What if he realized I was still awake and tried to force his way in? Every second stretched endlessly. I could hear faint movement through the door, a shift of weight, fabric brushing against wood, the subtle sound of breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. Hide, wait, scream, run. Then a single thought cut through the panic. The window. The bedroom had a window facing the driveway and my car. If I could get out quietly enough, I might be able to make it to the car before he realized what was happening. My hands trembled as I grabbed my keys from the nightstand. I eased the window open slowly, wincing at the faint creak of the frame. Cold air rushed in, biting against my skin. I didn't hesitate. I climbed out and dropped onto the ground, landing harder than I expected. I sprinted barefoot across the gravel, unlocked the car, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut. My hands fumbled the ignition twice before the engine finally roared to life. I tore down the driveway and didn't slow down until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. Police arrived later and searched the property. They didn't find the man, but they did find something that made my stomach turn. One of the windows on the far end of the cabin had a broken latch. It looked like it could have been forced, or maybe it had been broken for a long time. There was no way to tell. But the most disturbing detail came next. When officers checked the bedroom door, they found it unlocked. The push-pin-style lock had been disengaged. That meant the man hadn't been standing outside my door waiting to leave. He had been waiting to come in. If I'd stayed in that room waiting for help, I don't think I would have made it out. What unsettles me most is that he was there before I ever noticed him, watching me unload my car, waiting in the trees, studying the cabin, learning where the doors and windows were. He wasn't passing through. He was waiting for someone to arrive, and that someone was me. I didn't go back to the cabin for 2 days. I stayed at a cheap motel off the highway, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound in the parking lot. Every time headlights passed the curtains, my body tensed like I was about to run again. The police called me the next afternoon with more details. They confirmed that the window on the far side of the cabin had been forced open from the outside. The latch wasn't completely broken. It looked like someone knew exactly how to lift it just enough to slip inside quietly. There were muddy footprints beneath the window and along the side of the cabin leading toward the tree line. Whoever it was hadn't just wandered in by accident. He had approached deliberately, carefully, using the darkness and the terrain. What unsettled me most was what they found inside. The officer said the bedroom door had been unlocked when they arrived. Not damaged, not forced, just unlocked. That meant at some point after I ran out, the man had walked straight up to that door and opened it. If I had stayed inside and waited for police instead of running, he would have been standing over my bed in minutes. They searched the surrounding woods but found nothing else. No camp, no vehicle tracks, no clear trail leading away. Just scattered impressions in the dirt and leaves that disappeared deeper into the forest. It was like he had melted back into the land. The officer asked how long I had been staying there. When I told him I'd only arrived the evening before, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. The footprints near the tree line didn't look fresh from that night alone. Some of them were older, partially washed by recent rain, layered with newer ones on top. It suggested someone had been walking that perimeter multiple times before I ever arrived, watching the cabin, waiting. The idea that someone may have been observing the property long before I showed up made my skin crawl. It meant I wasn't just unlucky. I may have walked straight into a situation that was already unfolding. My cousin came down later that week and helped secure the cabin. New locks, reinforced windows, motion lights, cameras. He apologized over and over for letting me stay there alone without realizing how isolated it truly was. But the damage was already done. The place didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a blind spot in the world. Somewhere a person could disappear without consequence. I cut my trip short and went back home early. I stopped sleeping in unfamiliar places for a long time after that. Hotels, rentals, cabins, anything with too much silence made my nerves buzz. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound felt intentional. What bothers me the most isn't that someone broke into the cabin. It's that he was already there before I even realized I wasn't alone. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't leave when police came the first time. He waited until the house was dark, until I was asleep, until the doors were quiet and the wind masked his movement. He tested the place like a predator testing a fence. And if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't trusted that sick feeling in my chest, I don't know if anyone would have found me in time. Sometimes when I think about it too long, one question keeps coming back. Was he waiting for me specifically? Or was he just waiting for anyone to finally show up? Story 2. I used to think the worst thing that could happen in the mountains was getting lost, freezing, or running into a bear. I was wrong. The real danger wasn't the wilderness. It was the man who was already inside the cabin, waiting in the dark, holding a gun, watching my brother beg me not to come any closer. This happened when I was staying with my older brother Marcus at a remote cabin in northern Montana. The place sat low between two mountain ridges, hidden deep among thick pine trees, far from any real roads or neighbors. You couldn't see another building for miles in any direction. It was the kind of isolation we both loved. Marcus and I grew up hiking, camping, and exploring backcountry areas, so a weekend in a quiet cabin felt completely normal for us. The drive had been long and tiring, so we spent the first day moving slowly. We unpacked, walked around the clearing, enjoyed the mountain air, and stayed close to the cabin instead of heading out on any serious trails. By late afternoon, the sunlight was already starting to sink behind the peaks, throwing long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. Around 5:30, Marcus said he wanted to take a short walk before it got dark. He didn't bring a pack, water, or any gear, which told me he planned to stay close. I barely looked up from the couch near the fireplace when he stepped outside, just told him to be careful and relaxed back into the cushions. Exhaustion from the drive hit me hard. I drifted in and out of light sleep as the cabin slowly filled with dim orange firelight instead of daylight. It wasn't until the room was almost completely dark that I realized Marcus still hadn't come back. The fire was the only light source now, and outside the windows the forest had become nothing but black shapes and shadow. He shouldn't have been out there this long without a headlamp or jacket. My first thought was bears. That area had plenty of them. I grabbed my small day pack, clipped on a headlamp, picked up a flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold air hit my lungs instantly. The trail he'd taken was narrow and quiet, the trees closing in tightly on both sides. As I moved deeper along the path, my fear slowly shifted. It wasn't animal fear anymore. It was that strange, uncomfortable sense that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone even though I couldn't see or hear anyone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a silhouette standing between the trees behind me. Nothing ever appeared. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. About 10 minutes down the trail, I saw Marcus coming toward me. He wasn't running, but he was walking fast and stiff, like someone trying to put distance between themselves and something they didn't want to face. His face looked tight, uneasy. We started talking at the same time. I asked what was wrong. He told me to turn around and get back to the cabin. Neither of us waited for full explanations. We turned and fast walked back together, barely slowing until the cabin lights came into view through the trees. Once inside, Marcus told me what happened. He said he'd noticed someone standing off the trail, partially hidden behind trees. At first, he thought it was another hiker. But the longer he walked, the more he realized the man was matching his pace, always staying just far enough back to remain hard to see. Watching, following. Marcus said the man looked wrong. Dirty clothing, stiff posture, eyes locked on him in a way that made his skin crawl. He decided not to lead the stranger back to the cabin while it was still light. Instead, he slowed down and waited for darkness, hoping the man would lose interest and disappear. Marcus tried to downplay it afterward, saying he was probably overreacting, that it was safer to assume it was just some drifter or lost hiker. I wanted to believe him. Remote areas sometimes attract strange people. Still, the story sat heavy in my chest. We made dinner and spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch by a small fire, talking and pretending to relax. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both kept scanning the tree line, listening for footsteps, watching shadows shift between trunks. Nothing happened that night. The next morning, we packed for a long hike up one of the nearby ridges. The trail took us nearly 6 hours round trip. By the time we made it back to the cabin, our legs were shaking and our shoulders ached from the packs. Marcus dropped his bag near the door and said he was going to shower first. I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling while my heartbeat slowed. The cabin only had 2 rooms and 1 bathroom, so I waited. A minute passed, then another. For some reason, my mind drifted back to the man Marcus had seen the day before. I got up and glanced out the windows, scanning the tree line again. Nothing moved. I sat back down, but the unease didn't fade. Another minute passed, and I realized something strange. I couldn't hear the shower. The cabin's water pump was loud. Whenever someone turned on the water, you always heard it humming and vibrating through the walls. There was nothing. "Marcus," I called down the hallway. No response. A slow knot of dread formed in my stomach. I walked toward the bedroom door and knocked lightly, calling his name again. Still nothing. My hand hesitated on the door handle. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I cracked the door open just a few inches. Marcus was kneeling in the corner of the room, eyes wide, face pale. He was staring directly at me and slowly shaking his head, silently begging me not to come inside. The fear in his expression was pure and desperate. It froze me in place. Before my brain could fully process what I was seeing, my eyes shifted past him. There was someone else in the room. A man stood only a few feet behind Marcus. His eyes were wide in a way that didn't feel human. Not alert, not scared, but hollow and exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in months. His clothes were torn and filthy, dark stains smeared across the fabric. Long, greasy black hair clung to his face and neck. The smell of sweat and damp fabric hit me even from the doorway. Everything happened in less than a second. I didn't think. I didn't plan. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I lunged forward. As I closed the distance, I saw the man's hand move. Something dark rose from his side. A gun. The metal caught a flash of light. I slammed into him with my shoulder as hard as I could. The impact knocked all three of us into the wall. The gun clattered across the floor, skidding under the bed. Marcus jumped up instantly, grabbing the man's arms while I scrambled for the weapon. The stranger screamed, not words, just raw animal noise, thrashing violently, clawing, kicking, trying to bite. His strength was shocking. He fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. My fingers closed around the gun. I kicked it away toward the hallway and shouted to Marcus to hold him down. We wrestled him onto the floor. He bucked and twisted, trying to break free, eyes wild, veins bulging in his neck. It felt less like fighting a person and more like struggling with something feral. We realized fast we couldn't keep him restrained for long. Marcus was bigger and stronger than me, so we made a split decision. He would keep the man pinned while I got the car ready. I sprinted outside, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys. I threw our packs into the trunk. They were already packed from the hike, and started the engine. The sound felt deafening in the quiet forest. When I ran back inside, Marcus was still holding him down, muscles trembling with exhaustion. We grabbed whatever we could find, rope, cords, torn fabric, and tied the man's arms and legs just enough to slow him down. We took the gun with us. The entire time, he screamed, not angry screams, not pleading, just broken, chaotic sounds that echoed through the cabin and into the woods. We didn't wait to see if the restraints would hold. We bolted for the car, slammed the doors, and tore down the narrow dirt road, branches whipping against the sides of the vehicle. The cabin disappeared behind us in seconds. Once we finally reached cell service, we pulled over and called the police. Our voices were shaking as we tried to explain what had happened. Officers were dispatched to the cabin immediately. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. The ropes and fabric we'd used to tie him were scattered across the floor. There were drag marks leading toward the back door. No sign of him anywhere in the surrounding woods. Marcus later told the police what had happened before I opened the door. The man had surprised him inside the bedroom and held him at gunpoint. He ordered Marcus to call me into the room. Marcus refused, knowing it would put me directly in danger. The man grew more agitated, and then I walked in on my own. We still talk about how insane it was that I tackled him. Neither of us can explain why my body reacted that way. It could easily have gotten me killed, but it also might be the reason we're both alive. The only real lead authorities had came from the firearm. The gun was registered to a man who had been reported missing nearly 5 years earlier, about 50 miles from that area. But based on the description we gave, the person who attacked us didn't match the missing man's appearance, which leads to a terrifying possibility. Whoever attacked us may have already harmed the original owner of that gun. And if things had gone even slightly differently that night, Marcus and I might have ended up just as invisible. We left Montana the next morning and never returned to that cabin. Even now, years later, the image of Marcus kneeling in that corner, eyes wide, silently begging me to run, still flashes through my mind when I close my eyes. Some places don't just feel isolated. They feel watched. And sometimes the thing watching you is already inside. Story 3. I still don't know what scared me more that night. The man standing on the other side of the door, or the fact that he knew exactly whose cabin he was knocking on. He knew my father's name. He knew this place existed. He knew someone was inside, and if I had let my grief make that decision for me, I don't think I would have ever made it out of those woods. This happened in late October of 2019, about 8 months after my dad passed away. He used to own a small cabin deep in the forest, several hours away from the nearest real town. The town he grew up in barely existed anymore, just a stretch of abandoned storefronts, collapsing houses, and a cracked road that led nowhere. Nobody lived there permanently anymore, at least, not officially. My dad rarely talked about that place. He built the cabin when he was younger, back when the town still had people in life. Over time, everyone moved away. Businesses shut down. The school closed. Eventually, even the post office disappeared. He always said there was no reason to go back, but after he died, something kept pulling me there. I told myself I wanted to fix the cabin up a little, maybe replace some boards, clean out the junk, keep it standing for a few more years. In reality, I think I just wanted to feel closer to him, to sit in a place he once built with his own hands and try to understand the version of him I never really knew. I drove out early in the morning and reached the abandoned town just before sunset. I parked my car behind the crumbling shell of an old gas station, grabbed my backpack and tools, and started hiking the narrow trail that led toward the cabin. It was about 2 miles through dense woods, barely marked anymore, the path slowly being swallowed by nature. I came prepared to camp if the cabin had collapsed. Surprisingly, it was still standing. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing, wrapped in thick trees and tangled vines crawling up the log walls. It looked tired, weathered, forgotten, but solid enough to shelter me for the night. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, old dust, something faintly sour. There were no locks on the door anymore, and trash had been scattered across the floor, like someone had stayed there at some point and left in a hurry. Whoever it was, it didn't look recent. Everything was coated in a thin layer of grime and cobwebs. I cleared a small area near the wall, rolled out my sleeping bag, and set my pack down. The sun was already sinking behind the trees, and the forest outside was darkening fast. That night, I barely slept. Every 30 minutes or so, I jolted awake with a strange sense of dread crawling through my chest. Nothing had woken me, no sounds, no movement, just a heavy, uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. By the time morning came, I felt exhausted and strangely unsettled, like my body had never fully relaxed. At sunrise, I brewed a quick cup of coffee on my small camping stove and decided to take a short walk to clear my head. Not far from the cabin, I found a small hill overlooking the tree line. From there, I could see the abandoned town in the distance. Most of it was barely visible through the fog and morning haze. But one thing stood out: a light. Somewhere among the ruined buildings, a single window glowed faintly, then went dark a minute later. My first thought was my car. Panic hit my chest for a second, wondering if someone had found it. But the light was too far away, too high up, to be near the road. It looked like it came from one of the old buildings. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe urban explorers, maybe someone passing through. Still, it didn't sit right. I stayed on the hill for a while, watching the sunrise burn the fog away, then headed back to the cabin to start working on the exterior, resealing gaps, cleaning debris, making the place a little more stable. But the feeling followed me. All day long, I kept getting the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned my back to the woods, my shoulders tightened. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, scanning the tree line, listening for movement that never came. Logically, it made no sense. This area was isolated. The town was abandoned. There were no houses nearby, no trails that people normally used, and yet, the feeling wouldn't leave. As the sun went down, I went back inside and fired up the old wood stove. To my surprise, it still worked perfectly, filling the cabin with warm orange light and the comforting crackle of burning wood. I sat close to it, letting the heat soak into my bones, thinking about my dad, the memories I barely remembered, and the strange pull this place had on me. That's when I heard it. Not the fire. Something else. A crunch, then another. Footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought the sound was just a branch snapping under the weight of snow, or an animal moving through the brush. The woods are full of noises if you listen long enough, but this was different. The steps were slow, measured, intentional. Whoever was out there wasn't wandering. They were approaching the cabin directly. I leaned closer to the stove, trying to keep my breathing quiet as I listened. The crunch of boots on frozen leaves grew louder, closer, stopping just outside the front door. My heart began pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then came a knock. Not a casual tap, not a friendly knock. 3 heavy strikes against the wood. I froze. Before I could even process what was happening, a voice came from the other side of the door. "Daniel?" My entire body went cold. That was my father's name. For a second, I honestly thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Grief can do strange things to people, especially in places tied to memory. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Daniel, I know you're in there." My hand lifted slightly toward the door without me even realizing it. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what I'd just heard. How could anyone out here know my dad? How could anyone even know this cabin still existed? I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "Who is this?" There was a brief pause. Then the man answered calmly, "An old friend. We used to spend a lot of time together back when this place was alive." I was hoping to finally catch up with him. Something shifted in my chest. A strange mix of curiosity, sadness, and confusion pulled at me. Hearing someone mention my father like that, like he was still alive, stirred something vulnerable inside me. I stepped closer to the door, resting my hand against the cold wood. My father passed away earlier this year. Silence. I could almost feel the man on the other side processing that information. "I'm sorry to hear that," he finally said. His tone softened slightly. "He was a good man. Built this place with his own hands. Thought maybe I'd get the chance to see him again." His words sounded right, but the way he said them didn't feel right. There was something hollow underneath the sympathy, like it was rehearsed, forced. The longer he spoke, the more uneasy I became. "I didn't know anyone else still came out here," I said cautiously. "I live nearby," the man replied. "Been out here a long time. Hard winters, but you learn how to survive." A quiet chill crept down my spine. Nearby meant what, exactly? There were no houses for miles, no power lines, no maintained roads. He shifted his weight outside. I could hear his boots scraping lightly against the frozen dirt. "Why don't you open up?" he asked. "It's freezing out here. Would be nice to warm up by the fire and talk about your old man." The request sounded polite on the surface, but something in his voice carried impatience, like the kindness was thin and temporary. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body told me not to unlock that door, not to expose myself, not to let a stranger into a place where there was no help, no neighbors, no cell signal strong enough to matter. "How did you know someone was inside?" I asked. Another pause. "I saw the smoke from the stove earlier," he said. "Figured someone must be here." That answer made sense, but it didn't calm me. I didn't respond right away, trying to organize my thoughts. The silence stretched longer than I expected. Then his knuckles struck the door again, harder this time. "Go on," he said, his voice losing warmth. "Open it." My pulse spiked. I took a small step backward from the door. "I'm not comfortable letting anyone in," I said. The air on the other side of the door felt like it changed. His breathing grew heavier. The patience in his voice vanished. "Kid," he said slowly, "you really gonna let a man freeze to death out here?" Another knock, louder, sharper. "That's not what your father would have done." My stomach dropped. That crossed a line. My hand slid into my backpack, finding the cold handle of my hunting knife. My heart was hammering so violently I thought he might hear it through the door. The man's voice grew darker, more demanding. He started pacing slightly in front of the cabin, boots crunching in short circles. "You open this door," he muttered. "You hear me?" He struck the door again with his fist. I stayed silent. Minutes stretched painfully long. My legs ached from standing rigid. My mind raced through every possible outcome if that door opened, and none of them ended well. Then suddenly, the pounding stopped. I waited. My ears strained to catch any sound beyond the crackling stove. After a few seconds, I heard footsteps moving away from the cabin, slowly at first, then fading into the forest. I didn't move for a long time. I stayed by the stove all night, barely blinking, listening to every creak of the cabin and every distant noise in the woods. My body refused to relax. Every shadow felt alive. When the sky finally started to lighten with early morning gray, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely caring if anything was organized. I shouldered my pack, grabbed my tools, and stepped outside cautiously. The clearing was empty. No footprints near the door. No sign of where he'd stood. The forest looked calm and harmless in daylight, but I didn't trust it anymore. I hurried down the trail toward the abandoned town. My car was still exactly where I'd left it, hidden behind the old gas station. No signs of tampering, no tracks. I drove straight home without stopping once. It wasn't until days later that the full weight of what happened settled in. I realized how little I truly knew about my father's life before he moved away. Why he left that town. Why he never wanted to go back. Why he never talked about the people he knew there. That man knew my father's name. He knew where the cabin was. He knew someone was inside, and something tells me his intentions that night had nothing to do with catching up. If I had opened that door, I don't think I would have ever left those woods. Story 4. I used to think that if something truly dangerous was nearby, your body would react instantly. Heart racing, goosebumps, panic. Some obvious signal that screamed, "Get out now." I was wrong. Sometimes the danger feels quiet, ordinary, almost polite, and by the time your instincts finally wake up, the trap has already closed. This happened 2 years ago, during a short contract job I took in a remote coastal town. The company hired me to monitor environmental sensors along a stretch of cliffs where old communication towers once stood. Most of the infrastructure had been abandoned decades earlier, but the data lines were still active underground. My job was simple. Check the equipment once a day, log readings, and stay overnight in a small maintenance station nearby in case something failed during storms. The town itself was barely a town anymore. One diner, a gas station that closed before sunset, a few scattered houses hugging the foggy coastline. Tourists only passed through in summer. I arrived in late October, when the wind already smelled like winter and the ocean felt heavy and restless. The maintenance station sat alone on a rise overlooking the cliffs, surrounded by low scrub grass and twisted pines bent permanently by salt wind. It wasn't exactly abandoned, just forgotten. A single-story concrete building with reinforced windows, a metal door, a tiny bedroom, a kitchenette, and a narrow observation room facing the sea. There was no cell service up there, only a landline radio that connected to headquarters 40 miles away. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I actually liked the quiet. No traffic noise, no neighbors, just wind, waves, and the occasional gull screaming somewhere in the fog. My first night was uneventful. I cooked canned soup, logged the sensor readings, and listened to the building creak softly as gusts slammed against the walls. I slept deeper than I had in months. The second night was when something changed. It started small, subtle enough that I almost dismissed it completely. After finishing my rounds outside, I came back in and noticed the main door wasn't sitting flush in the frame the way it had been earlier. Not open, just slightly off. Maybe the wind had pushed against it while I was gone. The latch still held. I shrugged it off and locked it again. Later that evening, while reviewing logs in the observation room, I heard a faint metallic tap from somewhere inside the building. Not loud, just a single soft click, like someone gently touching a pipe or railing. I froze for a moment and listened. Nothing followed. Old buildings make noise, temperature shifts, pressure changes, metal contracting. I reminded myself of that and kept working. But over the next hour, it happened again. Tap. Then silence. The sound didn't come from outside. It echoed faintly through the walls, close, inside the structure. I walked slowly through the hallway, checking the bathroom, the bedroom, the storage closet. Everything was exactly where it should be. No movement, no open vents, no loose pipes vibrating. I went back to my desk feeling slightly unsettled but still rational. That night I dreamed of footsteps moving through fog. Slow, measured, always just behind me, never visible. I woke before sunrise with that strange feeling you get when a dream clings to your body longer than it should. The third day passed normally. Wind stronger, clouds lower, the ocean roaring against the rocks below. The sensors reported minor pressure fluctuations, nothing unusual for storms rolling in from the north. By evening, the fog had thickened until the world beyond the windows faded into gray nothingness. That was when the radio crackled unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting a call. The daily check-in wasn't scheduled until morning. "Station 3, you copy?" a voice asked through static. I picked up the handset. "Copy. Everything okay?" There was a pause. Static hissed. Then, "We're getting irregular signal spikes from your line. Interference or feedback. You noticing anything unusual up there?" I hesitated. The tapping noise crossed my mind, but it sounded ridiculous even to myself. "Nothing serious. Wind's picking up." "All right," the voice replied. "Probably weather distortion. Log it if it continues." The line went dead. I made dinner and sat by the small window overlooking the cliffs. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The fog pressed against the glass like a living wall. That's when I noticed movement. At first, I thought it was just fog shifting differently, but then a darker shape separated from the gray. Tall, thin, barely distinguishable, standing near the edge of the clearing beyond the building. A person. I leaned closer to the window, heart beating a little faster. The shape didn't move. No visible clothing details. No face. Just a silhouette swallowed by mist. I opened the door and stepped onto the small concrete porch. Cold air rushed around me. The fog muffled sound completely. I squinted toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. Nothing. Empty clearing, moving mist. The ocean's distant roar barely audible. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Low light, fatigue, fog distortion. I went back inside and locked the door. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, like the building itself felt occupied. That night, the tapping returned. Not once, not twice, several times, always from different parts of the structure. Sometimes near the storage wall, sometimes from the ceiling above the observation room, once from the hallway beside my bedroom. Never rhythmic, never predictable, just enough to keep my nerves slightly elevated. I slept poorly. The fourth day brought heavier wind and intermittent rain. Waves crashed violently below the cliffs. The fog never fully lifted. Everything beyond 30 feet remained blurred and colorless. During my afternoon inspection, I noticed footprints near the perimeter fence. Fresh. Not animal. Human boot prints, partially filled with rainwater. They circled part of the fence line before fading into the grass toward the fog-covered slope. No vehicles, no nearby roads, no trails leading up to the station. I radioed headquarters. Probably a hiker, they suggested. Maybe someone wandered too close to the restricted area. But the nearest public trail was over 4 miles away through steep terrain. I didn't like it. That evening, while documenting the prints, I heard the tapping again. Louder this time. More deliberate. Not a single click. A soft knock. 3 gentle taps against the interior wall. I stood slowly. The sound came from the hallway outside my bedroom. I listened. Silence. I walked halfway down the corridor, stopping short of the corner. The lights hummed softly overhead. Nothing appeared out of place.